This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to journalist Jacob Siegel, and we're going to be talking about something a little bit different for Popular Front this week. We're talking to Jacob about what can only be described as the new American culture war. So we're going to be talking to him about how America's deeply divided nation, due to the political situation, is leading further and further to violence, chaotic situations, and just a very big shift in the culture there. I think it's relevant to Popular Front, and I definitely think it's something worth talking about now as well. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. Go to patreon.com/popularfront. As a Brit, looking at what's going on in America right now, everywhere, with left, right, conservatives, liberals, radical liberals, all of that, you know, that whole mix, it seems like absolute chaos. Like, I can't quite get my head around what's going on where. So maybe you can explain, why is it at this stage? You know, how did it get like this?
Yeah, I think it feels something like chaos on this side of the pond as well. I think, you know, the most basic way to understand what's going on in America is that these very deep and significant divisions within American society first expressed themselves through the election of 2016. So Trump was a manifestation of these divisions in American society, and then once he was elected, he further entrenched those divisions and made them more volatile, more aggressive, brought the conflict out into the open. So the divisions that Trump was a manifestation of were racial, demographic divisions, class divisions, coastal versus, inland American divisions. These whole series of overlapping, related cultural, social identities. And the election played on all of those, and because the election effectively showed the political establishment, both the Democrat and Republican political establishment, to be really undermined to a significant degree, both by, I think, issues around kind of campaign financing and also by the internet, social media, online agitation. These older power brokers had been, they weren't made irrelevant. They still had some power, but they no longer had gatekeeper power. That's the political parties. That's the donor class to some extent. So what I'm saying is that there were these deep divisions in American society, and they really erupted in 2016. And ever since then, there's been this kind of ongoing conflict, and the most obvious manifestation of that conflict is, at the highest level is the Mueller investigation into Russian collusion with the Trump administration on the one hand, and then at the street level, it's these ongoing street battles between Antifa and these various left-wing anti-fascist groups and right-wing paramilitia groups like the Proud Boys or Three Percenters, and then also right-wing alt-right or white nationalist groups. And so it's playing out at a very high level, and it's also playing out at that kind of street fighting level, and it reflects very, very long-term, kind of long gestating divisions in American society.
Sure. And how serious are those street battles? Because when I first saw it, the Antifa versus fascist and right-wing groups and whatever in the US, it's like, we do this all the time in Europe. Like, it looked like, it was like whatever. But now, it certainly seems a much bigger deal since Charlottesville, of course, when Heather Heyer was killed. It definitely seems now things are getting serious in Portland, Oregon as well. I've been looking there. It seems all the time, every weekend almost, people are clashing on the streets of America because of their political divides.
Your framework is absolutely correct. Part of what's been startling to the American political system is that we're unaccustomed to this. So this kind of street volatility, which has been more of a norm in some European cities, some European countries, America really hasn't experienced this since the late 60s, early 70s. And so it comes as a shock to the system in a way that might sometimes exaggerate how consequential it actually is in terms of political violence or destabilizing the system, as it were. That said, it's gotten more serious in some ways. So Charlottesville was a real turning point, and there's a kind of anecdote that I've mentioned in other contexts, but a way to see the difference before and after Charlottesville is this. I went to two right-wing versus Antifa counter-protest events in Boston. That's sort of the easiest way to describe them. One was before Charlottesville and one was after. The event that I went to before Charlottesville had something like probably 300 to 400 people on the kind of right-wing side, and it was a kind of big tent, alt-light, alt-right, free speech, libertarian group on one side. So by alt-right versus alt-light, the distinction I'm making is between, kind of hardcore ethno-identitarian white nationalists on the one hand, and then on the other hand, people who you might just call kind of right-wing nationalists or nativists. So there were like 300 to 400 of them on the one side, and then on the other side there were probably a bit more, maybe 500 Antifa and left-wing groups on the other side. This was before Charlottesville. And it was very much a kind of like professional activist event, like average people in Boston were staring at this like, who the hell are these people? It was not something that brought average citizens out of their homes. Now, fast forward, that happened before Charlottesville. Fast forward to after Charlottesville, the same group of kind of young 4chan, right-wing, post-libertarian type kids who organized the first event, organized a second event. This is after Charlottesville. This time, it's heavily policed. There's no more than about, at the absolute most, 150 people on the right-wing side. They are penned off, cordoned off by the police, who have them confined to a very small space for their own safety. And there are probably something like 15,000 counter-protesters.
Wow,
so they're just
that's a big increase.
Enormous, exponentially more people. And that was really a direct consequence of what happened in Charlottesville, and I think also President Trump's response to what happened in Charlottesville, which really, his sort of downplaying of the violence and equivocation, saying there are bad people on both sides, I think galvanized a lot of people and it brought them out of their homes. So it got more serious after Charlottesville. And, just one last thing on that. One of the things that you see in terms of the violence here is that, recently in Portland there was a incident that was caught, I believe on film, where a left-wing protester with an American flag, so an anti-alt-right protester with an American flag, was attacked by people on the Antifa side. And that relates to what's, philosophically what's called the three-way fight. And this is the idea among some anarchist and left-wing groups that at any given time you have to be fighting both the far-right fascists and the liberal capitalist state. And what ends up happening at some of these events is the fewer far-right fascists are on hand, the more the violence turns against the emblems of the state, the spokespeople for the state. Whether that's a Bernie Sanders supporter who showed up with an American flag, the police, Starbucks, whatever it is. So, where there are kind of visible Nazis to fight, the fight is against Nazis. Where there are not visible Nazis to fight, the fight turns against the liberal state.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like people are extremely angry and perhaps don't quite know the best way to channel it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there are definitely a lot of people who are angry, dissatisfied, looking to vent, but then there are other people, particularly the more ideologically committed activists for whom this idea of the three-way fight is a kind of core principle. And it means that you can never lose sight of the fact, if you're somebody who believes in this, it means that you can't lose sight of the fact that your real enemy is not just the Richard Spencers and the kind of alt-right neo-Nazis. Your real enemy is also, liberal democracy and capitalism. And so that sometimes gets buried because in these larger events, in particular, where Antifa is one part of a much larger kind of counter-protest that involves all different sorts of liberal, left-wing groups, religious groups. The opposition to Nazism in America is pretty broad. It's not like Antifa are the only anti-Nazi groups in America. So the bigger the event, the bigger the kind of counter-protest, the more different groups it brings in, the less you see of that kind of hardline ideological activity. But you see it to some extent at almost all of these events.
Yeah, you mentioned 4chan there. I remember I used to go on 4chan years ago when I was like, young teenager. And look at Anonymous and the hacking and all that, and a lot of the Occupy stuff was always put up on there, and it was all right, I remember seeing it like slowly turn into this more kind of Nazi shit. And the kind of memes have been around for years, some of them, and I would have never thought they would have sway politically, but I don't know, it seems like they have. What do you think? Is that real?
Yeah, no, I think it's gotten a lot of sway, and I think particularly during the campaign, when Trump was still running for office, there was this real synergy between the Trump campaign and the kind of meme factories online. And these new mediums, these new digital mediums, have produced an environment where if you make an effective meme, it might get retweeted by the president's son. If you produce an effective meme, it can sort of cut through the normal barriers between an ordinary citizen and somebody in elected office or somebody in a position of power and influence, because if it replicates itself effectively enough online, it might reach that audience. Twitter in particular provides this kind of platform where you might get retweeted by Trump. You have to get seen by him first. But there's a way to kind of directly communicate with these people in positions of power who can then amplify your message. So that was particularly true during the campaign. But, I wrote a piece for Vice in early 2017. I think the title was, "Is America Ready for Meme Warfare?" But it was looking at the way in which this idea of memetic warfare has actually been taken seriously to some extent by the military establishment. So it's not just 4chan pranksters, and we can talk more about kind of the 4chan element of memeing and the political warfare, but it's something that's also been picked up. There was a few policy papers in American military journals kind of exploring the possibility of creating meme warfare centers, memetic warfare centers, and how this might be used.
So the US military were actually going to formally join the meme war, as it were.
Look, there are a lot of ideas that come out, a lot of different papers produced, but yeah, I mean, it's something that was considered, and it's something going back to 2005. There was this paper produced by a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps called "Memetics: A Growth Industry in U.S. Military Operations," and it laid out this kind of organizational hierarchy for how memes could be deployed by a military unit, and that was the Meme Warfare Center. And then after that, years after that, DARPA, which is, the Defense Research Agency, DARPA did a bunch of research into military memetics, kind of furthering this. And there have been a number of kind of points of convergence and synergy between the meme warfare people and elements within the Trump administration. So, you know, it's not official policy yet, but it's also not just going on like the B board on 4chan.
Sure. And why is it that specifically young American men seem so drawn into the meme culture and that? Because, you know, we have it here in England and in the UK, and I see memes, edgy memes, whatever, and it's quite funny, you know, it's a laugh, and you share it, whatever, but people are not that obsessed with it as they seem over there.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I haven't actually thought about that. It's a really interesting question. Why has it become so pronounced in the American political arena? I don't know quite how to answer that. My initial response would be that, you know, there are a lot of very online young men in America who are perhaps cut off from other forms of social relationships and who have invested an incredible amount of time into these digital environments online, where there's a very high premium placed on the ability to produce an idea, a visual meme-style idea that gets picked up. You know, there's like this very kind of Darwinian competition on a board like 4chan, where nothing is archived, where your name is not attached to anything, so you can't rely on being a known entity to get your ideas pushed to the top. And a meme is this kind of constituent, pared down unit of an idea. And it's like, you know, can you make something that people pay attention to?
Yeah, it becomes a one-time currency for them, basically.
Yeah, very much so. But if you get good at producing that currency once, maybe you'll be good at producing it again. And then once they get good at producing it, you can float these things into the culture. I think, you know what, Jake, that actually has a lot to do with it, is there's this relationship that got established between 4chan and the larger popular culture in America that you saw through stuff like lolcats and through Project Chanology, where they took on Scientology, where it really made this big impression, I think, on the people on these boards. It showed them that they could have a real influence on the larger culture and gave them the idea of themselves as these kind of, you know, mad geniuses working in these underground laboratories. Now, that gets wrapped up in several layers of irony and self-abuse and self-grandiosity and, you know, all these sort of different things. But because 4chan, through rickrolling and lolcats and all this other stuff, sort of saw its ideas pumped out into the mainstream, it produced this two-way channel between these meme factories and the broader culture that already existed before the campaign. So it was already in place before the campaign of 2016, and then it just sort of kicked into overdrive.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's kind of true now. Like, if you look at Trump's wombat son tweeting fucking QAnon conspiracy type stuff, you know, that all started on 4chan, and now you're seeing the president of the most powerful nation on Earth's son tweeting about it, knowing full well, surely, well, I don't know, he seems so fucking dumb, but surely, you know, it is getting to places in power somehow, whether that's by joke or whatever.
That's exactly right. It's not clear with QAnon exactly, you know, it's not clear exactly how it started, but there's some evidence to suggest that certainly from the beginning there were kind of deliberately fake elements injected into it, and perhaps some efforts to kind of cynically take this phony thing and pump it out there. But yeah, there's a real connection.
Yeah, the QAnon stuff is so fucking strange. Like, I watch, there's a few that I'll watch. This one guy, I forget his name, he's got his hair like slicked back and he's growing this massive beard out, and he just looks like he's been smoking meth for weeks. Like, his eyes are fucking wired. And and he just believes it all. And every time, like, one of the kind of, when they say things are going to happen, when it doesn't happen, he always has a reason, like, he can never be convinced it's not real. It's funny, man. But I watch it because I think, it's, I don't know, it's kind of fun, but I guess it's not. It's actually pretty fucking dark when you think about it. Talking about that, what do you make of the black pill, like when that's a big kind of community online now where, mostly American teens, I think it is, have been so red-pilled, which is, put onto kind of hardline conservatism or whatever. They've been so hard red-pilled that they end up kind of turning into the nihilist black pill. And it's interesting, the whole community, it's like, burn down the world, we need a war, we want to die, a brave kind of heroic death, and they kind of mix all this mad stuff in together. You got guys that are like praising Bosnian war heroes and wishing for the fucking world to collapse. And I don't know, it's interesting. I think it shows the real kind of stagnant Western boredom for a lot of these kind of middle American kids. But I don't know, what do you make of it, of the black pill?
Yeah, I think it was there from the beginning, probably, but was less salient, especially during the election, than the more standard line kind of right-wing nationalism. And that black pill philosophy, which is essentially a continuation of a nihilist tradition that stretches throughout European thinking in the 20th century, I mean, back to the late 19th century. But it recurs in moments of crisis, I think. This idea of the black pill as the revelation of an essential meaninglessness. If the red pill is the idea that there's a kind of progressive conspiracy to conceal the essentially, brutal reactionary truth of nature and social reality, the black pill is the idea that, there is nothing really worth conserving for a conservative, that far from there being a natural order worth defending, as a traditional conservative might argue, that the underlying truth is that, existence is meaningless, and we are only able to endure the meaninglessness of existence by feeding ourselves a steady diet of illusions. And, it might seem strange to have this kind of bleak existential nihilism wind its way into a sort of adolescent internet culture, but in another way it makes a lot of sense, because as the kind of foundational project of a society comes into question. So in America, as work and relationships start to fracture, wages have been stagnant here for something like 4 decades now. Through the ups and downs in the economy, there have been certain meta-economic conditions that wage stagnation shows that have made it more difficult for younger people in particular to advance financially and to feel like they're getting ahead of where their parents were, for instance. Dating has become more fraught. Relationships have become harder to form for a lot of people. This kind of breaks down along class lines to some extent, but levels of celibacy among both young men and young women are higher. So these are some of the most basic functions in any society, right? In a modern society, you're looking for work, you're looking for relationships to form, family formation. As these things start to break apart, or as they start to seem both less essential as they are kind of brought under ideological scrutiny and also harder to attain, then these very fundamental questions about what the meaning of life is come back to the surface. So I think the black pill in some way is a response to serious problems in the American project, and I think there's a kind of recurring perennial condition with some of this. That being said, I'm certainly not endorsing it by any means, but I think that, I don't know that it's able to tell. I don't know that some of the black pill sphere of the internet is always clear where people are taking this stuff seriously as a kind of philosophical outlook about the world, and where it provides this mode and style to really just let loose on how corrupt everything is. If you feel cheated by the dating world, if you feel that as a young white man in America, all of a sudden you're the minority and people are out to get you, and you can't even speak about this, and you take seriously these ideas about there being a program of white genocide, then the black pill provides you a language with which to rage against everything and to rage against the unfairness of existence in this sort of what appears to be a kind of high-minded way.
Yeah, one of the things that I found from the kind of black pill community, at least the ones that I've spoken to, they want a war, like an actual war, not like meme war or culture war. They want an actual war, or at least they think they do, purely because they're just, this is so boring, this kind of monotony of, modern Western existence, all of that carry on. And they think they actually want for there to be a war, and that thought, it really says something about the society, I think, when they've got to that point. And I think a lot of what it is, they just feel like they have no outlet, and people could argue, oh, fuck them. But this kind of ideas and kind of communities can actually turn into something really dangerous, as we know. And I'm not saying there's fucking black pill terrorists or anything like that, but you know what I mean? It can really manifest itself in a very dark way. And again, I just think that they feel they're kind of making themselves more isolated because they already think they're isolated,
That's exactly right. And maybe they want something serious to die for. Maybe they think there's nothing serious to live for, and if there's nothing serious to live for, then they at least want a kind of ecstatic orgy unto death, And the idea that this stuff is just a joke is a form of cowardice. If you want to be a nihilist dreaming about the apocalypse, at the very least, have the courage of your convictions. Don't pretend it's a joke. Obviously there are people who use this as a joke, but it expresses something very real. And the real thing that it expresses, I guess, to come back to what I was saying a moment ago, is not a new sentiment. If you go back and you look at the literature on the cusp of the First World War, I'm talking about the literature from some of Europe's great writers, D.H. Lawrence, Thomas Mann, they were ecstatic at the prospect of a civilizational war that would produce a cataclysm that could tear Europe apart, a great cleansing fire. Now, Mann spent much of the rest of his life kind of atoning for this wanton lust of violence, but he felt it, and he wasn't the only one. And it's, I think, a kind of response to a feeling of a culture becoming decadent. The irony is that it's a pure symptom of decadence. So the black pill, sometimes you'll find people in this kind of black pill mold who take on a kind of moralizing tone and suggest that, the great war that they want to come along is a war that the West deserves to have visited upon itself. The West has become effete and corrupt, and a war will cure this. Young men like themselves dreaming about wars online are not the antidote to decadence and corruption. They're a sign of decadence and corruption.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, actually. And how serious do you think all this is? I think you're in a really good place to have a clear picture of this. I see it, and after Charlottesville, it kind of died down a little bit in terms of the far right marches and all of that. But now, to me, it looks like something serious is going to happen. I don't know, maybe maybe there'll be a domestic terror attack, or I don't know, probably not. But what do you think? How serious do you think this is now? Because certainly from across the pond, it looks like a bit of a powder keg.
I think it's very serious. I think it's hard to say where it's going to wind up, whether it's with domestic terrorism spiraling out of control, or whether it's with a few acts of domestic terrorism that lead to a state crackdown, and possibly, I think the more likely scenario, if there was a spate of domestic terror attacks, would be an overreaction by the state that would empower a kind of quasi-martial law under Trump that I don't think would be good for anybody. But the fractures in American society and what I've referred to before as a kind of low-level multipolar civil war aren't going to resolve themselves by themselves, and neither is the American political process going to naturally take care of this stuff. We've been here before in the 60s and early 70s, and the way this was resolved, not only by acts of violence, but the way this was resolved really was by the formation of a new consensus in American society, a new kind of cultural consensus. The phrase culture war comes from this famous speech that right-wing politician Patrick Buchanan gave at the 1992 Republican Convention in America. And he's talking in that speech about a war that he calls a religious war going on in this country. And I'll quote from him: "It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America." That's Buchanan in 92, and what he's really talking about, he talks about the Clinton-Gore ticket, which eventually won in that year. It was the Democratic ticket that put Bill Clinton in office, that they're the most pro-lesbian and pro-gay ticket in history. This is Buchanan warning about this stuff. But what Buchanan is really signaling in 92 when he talks about this culture war is that the fruits of the 1960s had produced a new cultural consensus in America. And that cultural consensus took decades to consolidate into a kind of institutional authority. But it was there, and it produced a new regime, a new way of doing things, some good, some bad. But that, in effect, was the resolution to the culture war. The resolution was that one side won. And when one side wins, the war ends, or at least becomes dormant for a while. And then it's on the winning side to prove that that their way of doing things works, and to exert their power and authority in such a way that either accommodates their opponents and, pacifies them, or that marginalizes them in some way. That's how a ruling power stays in power. In America right now, in 2018, it seems hard to imagine a new cultural consensus forming anytime soon, but it could happen. I don't think it seemed clear in the late 60s that generation was, or the cultural consensus that was sort of brewing then, was going to become as powerful and as deeply vested in authority as it is now. So that could happen. The other thing that could happen, though, is just an ongoing balkanization in American society, where people sort of retreat into their different regional and institutional and cultural spaces, and get further and further away from those with whom they disagree and feel that they don't share values, and that the war will then be fought between competing institutions.
Well, with that being said, can you sum up for us who is fighting who specifically right now in the, the new American culture war?
Yes, on the street level, there's sort of several different fights going on at the same time. At the street level, which is where, the most active fighting is going on, there are these right-wing groups that span from nationalist groups that you might compare to, like, I guess the EDL might be, Tommy Robinson's group might be a kind of point of comparison.
Which is the English Defence League, a very right-wing sort of street movement that we had here for quite a while. It's still about, but it's not as big now.
Yeah, exactly. So there are groups in America that are sort of comparable to the English Defence League in that they have, at this point, repudiated racism. They say they're not racist, but they are right-wing nativist groups. And so they're spanning from groups like that to groups that are avowedly, explicitly white nationalist, to this other sort of movement we have in America that I don't think you have any analog for in Britain, which is the so-called patriot movement, which are these sort of nativist militia groups, paramilitia groups. And that's on the one side, this right-wing coalition. On the left side, Antifa is the face of it, but there are also other left-wing groups involved in the fighting. But on the street level, it all sort of falls under the umbrella of Antifa for now. That's who you see, those groups. On a larger level, what the easiest way to describe it is there is a basically unbridgeable divide at this point between the Trump coalition and the anti-Trump coalition. So this is not sort of politics as usual where, hey, the other side won, but we're going to try to push back against their policies and vote them out of office. This is the side that won is fundamentally illegitimate, both because of its values, because Trump, now I'm speaking sort of for the opposition now, Trump is a, crypto white nationalist. He's a stooge of the Russians. Every manner of delegitimizing the democratic election of Trump is employed, and it's employed by different people for different reasons. And there are different levels of truth and credibility in the different allegations made against the Trump administration. But the bottom line is that democratically elected president, and even that's a controversial claim, right? But a democratically elected president is... there's a delegitimization campaign active and ongoing that's not only led by like hardcore ideologues, it's led by the elected opposition party. The Russia investigation is very much a way of delegitimizing the sitting president. So that's one side. The other side, the kind of MAGA side, the Trump supporters see this deep state conspiracy that involves the academy, the liberal media, the elite cultural institutions, all of whom are involved in trying to repress this populist revolt. And they do that through manipulation of public sentiment and through these kind of shaming campaigns. There's an interesting analyst in America named John Robb, and he's actually a guy who comes out of war. He's a former Air Force Special Operations guy in America. He wrote a good book called Brave New Future, and he's somebody who studies kind of networks and insurgent networks in particular. And what Rob talks about is these two groups that he refers to as bad boys and mean girls. And the bad boys are the Trump network, and the mean girls are the anti-Trump cultural network. And they're involved in these active campaigns against each other. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, Jacob, about where this is all gonna wind up. But I think we'll have a better sense of that after the midterm elections here. But it's certainly not going to resolve itself anytime soon.
No, it's something I find very interesting, and I might be wrong. I'm not even 30 yet, but I feel like Britain has never been so interested in American politics, at least since, I don't know, the Iraq War. And it seems that everybody's kind of talking about it and looking at it a little bit now.
An interesting note with that is American politics have never looked more European, right? So that's the counterpoint. I wrote an article for Politico in early 2017 about exactly this. I forget the title, but if people Google my name, Politico, it's the only thing I ever wrote for them, it'll come up. But the article is about how Donald Trump and the movement he represented, despite appearing to be this American nationalist movement, are actually deeply European in some ways. The alt-right is actually a very European movement in a lot of ways. And the point where the alt-right and Donald Trump overlapped is closer to a kind of right-wing statism that you'd find in the National Front, for example, the French National Front, than anything you would have found in Republican politics going back for 3 decades.
Well, yeah, Steve Bannon for a while was trying to kind of court the quote-unquote right-wing populists that are kind of all over Europe right now. And also, you know, he's been seen speaking to George Galloway as well. I mean, that guy's a fucking moron, but there's a kind of alliance there, the anti-liberalism alliance, I guess. But yeah, I definitely think the UK has started to take, the right wing have started to take from America a little bit. So you'll see kind of these, you know, like these identity Europa type groups or generation identitaire. Well, I guess that started in France, but there is definitely a crossover. These, you know, these kind of fascism for rich kids, that kind of stuff. I think there's definitely a lot more communication now, certainly between, you know, for example, even Atomwaffen Division had a UK cell for a while. It's a lot is going on. But yeah, something I wanted to ask as well. Tell me about Manifesto, your podcast. I love the concept about it. Explain to us what it is.
Yeah, it's myself, and my co-host is Phil Cly, who's a Marine veteran and a writer. He wrote a book of short stories called Redeployment that won a National Book Award. Phil's one of the best writers alive right now. And he and I, every week we take, or every episode, it's usually every couple of weeks, we take a manifesto. It could be a political manifesto, an artistic manifesto, and we read it and we talk about it, like, what was this vision for the world? So what did the person who wrote this manifesto want to achieve for the world, and what would it look like if the world was actually remade in the image of this manifesto? And then we also talk about a work of art, and we sort of compare and contrast them. So, like, we've done the Humanist Manifesto. We did Valerie Solanas, who people might know as the crazy playwright who shot Andy Warhol.
Yeah, that was my favorite episode. It's the she's the extreme radical feminist, right?
That's exactly right. The Society for Cutting Up Men. So we took Scum. We took Andrea Dworkin, who's another radical feminist, her work, Intercourse. We talked about that, and then we talked about the New Yorker short story, Cat Person, and tried to sort of see what it all meant. And, you know, that's really it. It's like we felt like there's enough people just expressing their opinions, and we didn't want to do that. So we wanted to give ourselves, the same way you have, you know, this lens to see the world through. We wanted to give ourselves a lens to see the world. And the lens we chose was people's attempts to remake the world around them through these manifestos, or their ideas for how the world should be remade.
And people should definitely listen to Manifesto. I think if you like Popular Front, you're going to like Manifesto. Look it up on iTunes. Jacob, where can people get hold of you if they want to contact you, look at your work, that sort of thing?
Just Google my name, Jacob, Jacob, Siegel, Siegel, and, you know, you'll find me.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, mate.
Cheers, Jake. Thanks.
That was Jacob Siegel talking about the new American culture war and how the political divisions in the US escalating further, becoming more violent, and seemingly spiraling out of control a little bit. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting on the Patreon. You can get bonus episodes, access to the Discord, audio articles, all sorts of stuff is on there, and it costs very little. So go to patreon.com/popularfront. Alternatively, if you don't like Patreon, which is completely understandable, go to popularfront.co/support. There are many other ways to support us there, including Bitcoin. I know you lot are all flush right now, so do consider supporting us. Thank you very much to the Apple shop. Recently they fucked one of my phones up, and now I lost some Bitcoin as it's on the rise. So thanks very much, Apple, Steve Jobs. Thanks very much. This episode was sponsored by the defensepost.com, defense with an S. Go there to read about various conflicts all around the world, reportage you probably won't see elsewhere. This episode is also sponsored by Umbrella Security, which is a free open source all-in-one app for digital and physical security. It isn't just some bullshit advertisement. The guy Rory was like, Jake, check this out, I think you'll like it, because, you know, obviously I do reporting trips in hostile environments. Had a look at it, and definitely I think it's good. And it was me who suggested it. I said, hey, sponsor an episode. So it's not like someone is just trying to sell you shit. Trust me, I think Umbrella Security is cool. And you can redistribute it as well for free. They're happy with that. There is no catch or anything like that. So yeah, look it up, iTunes, Android, Umbrella Security. If you want to keep up to date with Popular Front, you can follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/Jake_Hanrahan, or the Popular Front Twitter. If you can't be bothered with me, I don't blame you. That is twitter.com/PopularFrontCO, which is the same as the website. So if you want to see the articles, all the Popular Front episodes, all the videos, all of that put into one place, easily accessible, www.popularfront.co. Depending on which system you're using, apparently you have to put the fucking www in. I don't know why, but there you go. But yeah, popularfront.co, check that out. Follow us on Instagram, that's instagram.com/popular.front. There's stuff on there that you probably won't see on the Twitter. We do kind of, now and then we've been doing some kind of behind the scenes stuff, showing how we build an episode. Sam Black, Son of Old, put a bit in there showing how he builds a beat. So, you know, there's stuff on there. Thank you very much to the following people on the Patreon. Without you, this would not be possible. Thank you to Adam Berg Snyder, Andrew Fife, Axel Iverson, Brian McLaughlin, Callum Ross, Chad Walker, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Diana Gorvanek, Elizabeth Benicki, Emiliano, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Joanne Stocker, Joel Tambusi, Kay Hardy Roberts, Kyle N. Payne, Lawrence Abrahams, LH, Margaret Bowling, Michael Euler, Noah, Ari from the Discord, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormack from What Bitcoin Did, Q-Ball, Russia Alakidi, Ryan Sandercock, Scartoon Music, Scott Jonesy, Sebastian from the Discord, Surushe Hawazi, Stephen Davila, Teddy, Tom Lochrin, Tony Bin, Vida Provost, and Zachary Hinch. Thank you all very much. Also a big thank you to Anthony Kabarik. He's been helping us fund trips to do our next documentaries. And if you want to help Popular Front, as I said at the start, please do consider supporting us. Go to patreon.com/popularfront or popularfront.co/support. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Son of Old. Go to soundcloud.com/son-of-old. He's just been put in for the SoundCloud partnership thing, whatever the fuck it is. So yeah, do check his music out. There's going to be a lot more stuff on there soon.